This is a podcast for patriots who think. Now, here's your host, Jeff Nyquist.
Welcome to another podcast, and with me is my guest, Stephen Baskerville. He is a professor of government at Patrick Henry College and former president of the American Coalition for Fathers and Children. He holds a PhD from the London School of Economics and is a fellow at the Howard Center for Family, Religion, and Society. Welcome to the podcast, Stephen.
Thank you.
You know, you are the author of a book, Taken into Custody, The War Against Fathers, Marriage, and the Family, and I was given this as a Christmas gift a few years ago, and it so took me by surprise. You know, I had in my mind this idea of the deadbeat dad, you know. This is a guy that wants to chase women or hang out in bars, who doesn't want to take care of his kids, who wants to neglect his wife. And that, you know, the problem with all these guys out there is they just need the law to lean on them to make them cough up the money so their children and wives can be taken care of. Is there a problem with this stereotype in your understanding of and your research?
There's a very serious problem with the stereotype. Not only is it untrue, but it justifies and rationalizes policies that create precisely the problem that it's supposed to be solving. In other words, this stereotype is almost entirely feminist propaganda. But the problem, the larger problem, the more serious problem, is that by perpetuating this, we put into place policies which are actually creating more fatherless children. Mm-hmm. For an example, most of these fathers that you're talking about here have not abandoned their children. Uh-huh. The vast majority of fathers have their children stolen from them by the family court machinery. I talk about that extensively in the book. I look at the evidence very clearly.
Now, how big of a thing is this thing where children are taken away from their fathers? What percentage of fathers face this problem or have faced this problem?
Well, it's a massive problem. It's well known that some 25 million children in this country grow up without their fathers. The assumption of most people is that the fathers have abandoned their children. And this is propagated by various respectable authorities, such as David Blankenhorn in his book, Fatherless America. Blankenhorn doesn't give a shred of evidence for this, and in fact, there is no evidence. With the married fathers, we know the vast majority of divorces are filed by mothers. The vast majority of these are not for any grounds whatsoever. They're simply no-fault divorces where no grounds have to be given. And the reason the woman gives usually is that she doesn't feel loved or that she's grown apart, doesn't feel appreciated. So usually their fathers are involuntarily divorced through literally no fault of their own. Their children are then confiscated from them, again, through no fault of their own, because no fault has to be shown in order for the children to be taken from the father and given to the mother mostly or entirely. They've lost their children entirely through literally no legal fault of their own. They've done nothing civilly or criminally.
Now, let me ask you about that. You mentioned no-fault divorce, and I had understood that before this happened, in order to get a divorce, your spouse had to have done something illegal. Is that right? Like adultery?
Some infraction, a civil infraction at least, such as you say, there were standard grounds which varied from jurisdiction to jurisdiction.
And that no longer applies. Now, no-fault divorce, you can just say, I don't love him anymore, or, oh, he doesn't love me anymore, and bam, that's it.
Well, correct. And it's more than no-fault divorce. It's unilateral divorce. It's involuntary divorce. There's evidence that many state legislators were deceived into believing that what they were voting for was divorce by mutual consent. It is, in fact, involuntary divorce. You can be divorced unilaterally by your spouse without having to give any reasons. Maggie Gallagher calls it the abolition of marriage.
Yeah.
And that's effectively what it is. There is no enforceable marriage contract.
So basically, as I understand contract law, if you make a contract with me, you have to keep it. You can't just say, oh, this isn't working for me, I'm leaving. But in marriage, it's not an enforceable contract. Would that be accurate?
That's precisely accurate. To my knowledge, it's the only unenforceable contract in the United States because under the Constitution, states cannot pass laws that abrogate the enforcement of contracts, which is precisely what they've done here.
Now, would that be unconstitutional then? Are these laws somehow against the whole principle of law?
Oh, absolutely. That's only the beginning of the unconstitutionality of these laws. In my book, in one chapter, I go through the Bill of Rights and other constitutional provisions one by one, and I show how virtually every one of them is violated by the no-fault divorce laws.
And I found most shocking in your book is you talk about the apparatus attached to this family law and divorce system which basically plunders the wealth of families and enriches itself. Could you describe that for us in a little detail here?
Well, divorce courts are a massive machinery for plundering, for looting fathers once the children are taken away from the father. And that's always the first action they take. That's the first principle of divorce court. Separate the children from the father. It's the very first thing they do. Once the children are separated from the father becomes an object of plunder. And it's all justified as being for the good of the children. Of course, if the children were just left alone with the father in the first place, they would be fine. But instead, the father is vilified as a bad father. The children are taken from him, and then he's ordered to pay exorbitant amounts of money in child support for the good of his children, when he may have been supporting them perfectly well on his own before this. He can be ordered to pay 70%, 80%, 90%. I can go on.
You mean a court could say, all right, now you make $25,000 a year, you're going to pay $35,000 a year to your wife. Now, what happens if he doesn't pay?
He is summarily incarcerated. He's arrested and jailed without trial.
So then he really can't even pay the $25,000 then?
That's correct. And he just goes further into debt.
And does this incarceration lead to indefinite incarceration?
We have cases of fathers being jailed for up to 10 years without trial.
Without trial. Now, as I understand the Constitution, something that can deprive you of your freedom, you must have a trial by jury in order for that to happen. In this case, it doesn't count. Juries don't count?
There's almost never a jury trial on child support. I've never heard of one. They may call it a trial, but it's usually part of the judge.
What percentage of men that are unable to pay end up being jailed? Do they jail in every case, or is this just a hit and miss thing?
We don't know. It seems to be very hit and miss in some ways. It varies by jurisdiction. It varies according to whoever is the attorney general. It's the attorneys general who are the ones who generally grandstand over this and try to advance their careers by attacking fathers.
Deadbeat dads are a special target that will win over the women vote, I guess, for a DA or a aspiring politician.
Well, that's right. And what's especially dangerous about the child support is not that it's simply that fathers are forced to pay astounding, impossible amounts, but it's making the situation worse. It's effectively bribing the mother to divorce, because what she gets out of this is not only control of the children, but tax-free income, which she can do anything she wants with. She doesn't have to spend it on the children, so she can simply demand that her husband pay extortionate amounts of money on pain of incarceration, at gunpoint, literally. And she gets a windfall, a tax-free windfall. If you can raise your children, you still get your husband's income without any of his opinions, and you can raise the children as you choose and get paid for it. That's a pretty hefty incentive, bribe, if you like.
And as we all know, a woman needs a man like a fish needs a bicycle, right?
Well, precisely. Yes.
These judges that make these decisions, what kind of judges are these? These, I assume, are local state judges in the local state courts?
They are the part of the state judiciary, and they are the lowest. They're paid very well. They're paid well over $100,000 a year, but they are the lowest in the judicial hierarchy, usually appointed by the bar associations. The bar associations have a big role in the appointment and promotion of family court judges. And the feminist bar associations are the ones that take an interest in family law. So effectively, they are appointed by feminist lawyers. So they have an incentive to funnel money into the pockets of the people who give them their jobs. This is well known in the judiciary. It's been happening for decades. The judges reward the people that put them in power. But the divorce system has opened the floodgates, not just businesses and corporations, but ordinary men who don't make a lot of money. And it's opened them to plunder by these judges and by the bar association.
Now, I have another question. Many of our listeners, no doubt, because it's become the fashion, are living with their significant other, having children, and not actually getting married. Are these men who are living with a woman and raising a family without the actual marriage contract, are they also vulnerable to this court system?
Oh, absolutely they are. The married men are not in any way invulnerable. In other words, getting married doesn't give you any protection.
So basically, marriage is meaningless. The thing that gets you into trouble is living with a woman and having children by her, and that immediately exposes you to arbitrary imprisonment, the loss of everything you have.
That is correct. And the only solution is simply don't have children.
So that means that only a person who is a fool or who is absolutely certain of the loyalty of the woman would dare get married. Now, you said something that was striking to me earlier. You said that most divorces are initiated by women. And that may come as a surprise to people. I think I've seen the figure 80%. But is that correct? Is it about 80% that women initiate divorces over men?
Yes. Sanford Braver, in his book on the subject, came up with a figure of about 2/3. But that was a very conservative estimate. He was being very cautious. Robert Seidenberg and others have found evidence that in cases involving children, it's much higher.
Really?
Yes. It's a power grab. It has nothing to do with couples deciding to go their separate ways. In many cases, the husband doesn't even know what's happening. He comes home one day and the children are gone and there's a note on the table and he's summoned to court. And that's the first he knows about it.
That's very interesting. You know, I was reading Gustave Le Bon, who was writing over 100 years ago about power. And he said this about socialism. He was writing, The Psychology of Socialism was the book, and he was saying that under a socialist system, the game was to disempower the strong and empower the weak. Is that what is happening here? Is that the woman as the weaker sex has been empowered and the man as the stronger sex has been totally disempowered in the relationship?
Yes, the woman has been empowered in alliance with the state. Her power comes entirely from the power of the government. It's the woman in alliance with the judge, the lawyers, the various hangers-on. So yes, it's the woman in collusion, in alliance with the state, and the father is alone on the other side.
So does it ever happen that a clever man, can get a lawyer, divorce his wife, preempt her, and take the children and do all this in reverse to the woman?
Yes, it does happen. And these are the exceptions that prove the rule. Lawyers, judges, others who know how to play the system. If they act first and they act aggressively, they can do it to the woman.
So if a woman is married to a lawyer, it is like a game of chicken then, basically, if they have kids.
Yes. The game theory that I connected to in my book is a game theory called prisoner's dilemma.
Oh, yes.
Which is based on the concept that whichever prisoner betrays the other prisoner first wins.
Yes.
And gains everything. But if the other one betrays you first, you lose everything. So you have a rush to the trigger. Whoever pulls the trigger first wins.
Yeah.
It's a rush to the courthouse.
So we're also talking about the demoralization of society in the area of reproduction in a very fundamental way.
Oh, absolutely. Yes, very much so. Glenn Sachs wrote a good article showing that men were basically deserting marriage. Men were refusing to marry and have children.
I am Jeff Nyquist. I'm talking to Stephen Baskerville. He is the author of Taken into Custody, The War Against Fathers, Marriage, and the Family. And I think many listeners are going to be shocked by what they're hearing. Many will understand it from firsthand experience. Now, this idea of the total disempowering of man, I mean, what you're telling me, Stephen, is that the feminists have won a total victory, an absolute total victory over the masculine sex. Would that be correct?
In many areas of life, yes, they have. And we can see this being played out in many, many cases. Part of a much larger politics of sexuality the feminists are playing. And we can see this, and the homosexuals as well. All of these things, they're driven by unrestricted sexuality. False rape allegations, false accusations of domestic violence. And it's been very much hushed up. I mean, you look at what's happened in the military, for example. Many soldiers, sailors, airmen are sitting ducks for divorce because they're helpless. They can't defend themselves. They're away on deployment. They can't fight in court to keep their children. They can't get a modification of their child support. They may be living on reservist salary, which is a reduction in their civilian salary. So they're helpless, and they are just destroyed, forced out of the military.
And they're forced out because they are unable to pay, or how are they forced out?
Yes, in a number of ways. First of all, they can be arrested for not paying child support while they're on deployment. Military men are actually forced to share their pensions with wives that they maybe have been married for a few days. You can marry a military man and collect his pension immediately, and he's required to pay it as soon as he's eligible for retirement. Not when he actually retires, but when he's eligible for retirement, he must start sharing his pension with his spouse. It's quite astounding. All of the ways in which the sexual agenda is debilitating our society is quite amazing.
Now, psychologically, have women always been this assertive and just weren't able to assert themselves? And what percentage of women are availing themselves? You mentioned 25 million children raised without fathers. I mean, how many children are in the country altogether, and what percentage of the families are being affected by this?
Well, it's huge. I mean, not all divorces are as aggressive and devastating as they could be. Some divorces do end up being by mutual consent.
Mm-hmm.
But the point is that any man who marries or has children is vulnerable to this action. All it takes is one phone call to the domestic violence industry or to the police, and he can be removed within a matter of minutes.
And there's no due process. He doesn't get a day in court. He doesn't get a jury. He doesn't get anything.
That's correct. He might not be incarcerated, but he will be punished in some way.
Now let's talk about the children and what happens to them. And you talk about this in your book. And again, we're talking about millions of children being affected in the United States in this way. When these proceedings begin, let's say there's 2 children in the household, how are the children separated from the father? What process is used? How does the state intervene in terms of the children?
Usually the woman has consulted a lawyer in advance. Often she's consulted some feminist center. Like here in Washington, we have the Vienna Women's Center. And they counsel women on how to play this game and how to act. So the woman is usually well briefed in advance, and generally she's advised to get the children away from the father somehow. Now, what she might do is, if she wants to leave anyway, she might snatch the children and go live with a friend or a sister or her parents or to a battered women's shelter. That's one way. Or if she doesn't have any place to go like that, she can use the domestic violence accusations to get the father out of the house. So all she has to do is pick the telephone up and say that she's living in fear and that she's going to be a victim of domestic violence. And usually within minutes, the police will be there and they will arrest him and take him away. And that's the aim of all this, is to get him separated from the children. And the domestic violence accusations are available if necessary. He may not be jailed for domestic violence if he hasn't actually committed any, but he probably will be forced to take some kind of classes, some kind of domestic violence awareness training or something like that.
Mm-hmm.
Well, the point is get him out of the house, get him away from the children. Once you've done that, then everything else follows. Then there's implement what is called a temporary custody order, and that will give the mother temporary custody. Temporary custody is permanent, effectively. The burden of proof is then on the father, and the financial burden is on the father to prove why his children should be returned to him. There's no burden on the state to prove why the children were taken away from him or justify why the children were taken away. The burden of proof falls on him to prove why his children should be returned to him. And this, of course, is why everyone makes a lot of money.
So basically, he's shelling out money for lawyers, she's shelling out money for lawyers, and the lawyers are getting rich, and the system is getting enriched, and the family's getting impoverished.
That's correct. It's essentially a system of judicial kidnapping. In fact, that's the term I use in my book, is judicial kidnapping. They seize your children, and if you want them back, you pay.
And if you don't pay, you're taken into custody.
If you don't pay the lawyers, you'll pay in child support. In one way or another, you'll pay.
If the judge is ordering you to pay a large percentage of your salary that's abnormally high to child support and so on, what do you have left to pay for lawyers to defend yourself?
Judges are usually pretty good at making sure that lawyers get their fees first. Because the lawyers are their cronies, and the Bar Association gives them their jobs. So they usually make sure that you've got enough money to put down a retainer and put out 10 or 20 or 50,000 for a lawyer. And if you hire a lawyer, you might get your child support lowered. Just to give you an example, I went into court for a child support hearing without a lawyer, and I was forced to pay 2/3 of my salary as a result. I was left with $900 a month to live on.
So they basically penalize you for not hiring them.
Precisely.
It seems to me that now every woman is married, really, in reality, to the state, and that the men are just guests in her home, and that the children are basically, in reality, wards of the state. Would that be misstating what's really effectively happened in a legal way?
No, absolutely. And like many wards in history, they're tools, they're pawns in the game.
So we're talking about an enormously corrupt system, a system meant to enrich a class of people, lawyers, that is going to not change since our state legislatures are mainly crewed by lawyers, unless what happens? I mean, is there anybody out there? I mean, you got feminists defending women. Who's defending men in the family out there?
Well, that's the problem, is nobody is. I mean, we have a lot of groups out there claiming to defend the family, but they won't touch these issues. And this is very disturbing because the most direct threat to the family today are the divorce courts. And yet the organizations that claim to be pro-family have done almost nothing to address the divorce issue.
Is that because of the idea of chivalry, that you never say anything bad about a woman, that it would be perceived as attacking women, and men have been drilled in the era of their supremacy over women to be gentle?
I think that's part of it. I think it's also the power of the attorneys and the bar associations, even among conservative groups. Also, once people realize the enormity of this danger, just how huge this is, they become intimidated and don't want to face it. They don't want to believe that something this massive and this evil can have put out its hooks throughout our whole society, its tendrils everywhere. And it just seems like too big a machine to take on. On the other hand, if we did take it on, we would start to be taking on the problem. Unfortunately, what too many pro-family groups are doing now is they're simply scolding. They're lamenting and bemoaning. It's much easier to just scold people and nag people instead of actually facing the problem.
And now the media. Has the media ever even touched this issue?
The media has done very little. Melanie Phillips in the Daily Mail in Britain has written well on it. Kathy Young at Reason Magazine has written on it. There have been a few, but many of them give up. They write well-stated, articulate exposés of this. Then nothing happens. Nothing happens. Nobody takes it up. And so they give up in frustration.
Now, you mentioned someone in another country. Are the other first world countries, for example, of Western Europe and, I don't know, Japan, also have this situation? Or is it just the United States? Does Canada also have these kind of laws?
Yes, this is almost ubiquitous in the Western world. We are the ones that came up with the no-fault laws first, and we exported them to other countries. In some ways, other countries are worse, and in some ways they're better. For example, in many countries, in Europe especially, fathers are cut off from their children entirely. It's not unusual in Germany or Japan or Britain for the fathers then never to see their children. On the other hand, they don't seem to have the level of incarceration yet. So in terms of the penal apparatus, the United States is the worst. I take that back. Canada is worse. Canada has probably more draconian as far as jailing fathers for child support and for domestic violence.
I'm Jeff Nyquist. With me is Stephen Baskerville. He's the author of Taken into Custody, The War Against Fathers, Marriage, and the Family. And if you haven't heard about this before, you've got to hear about this. This is one of the big stories of our time. This is a social change, an earthquake, a tectonic change in society. Stephen, about when did this start to happen? When did no-fault divorce start to come in the United States?
The first no-fault divorce law was passed in California in 1969. And it very quickly swept the state legislatures after that and virtually the entire Western world. It is very striking how fast the legislatures just passed this measure with no debate, no discussion, no public dialogue whatsoever about the pros and cons of it. This was at the height of the sexual revolution. Everybody was obsessed with civil rights, and Woodstock was the atmosphere of the day. So there was virtually no debate about this anywhere. And it took off very, very quickly. In many ways, no-fault divorce kind of ratified and accelerated what had already been developed for some decades before that. Barbara Defoe Whitehead writes in her book that, divorce is very American. It does go back to the foundation of the Republic. So it's not brand new, but it's the sexual revolution really, really propelled it forward.
I can't help remembering something that Nietzsche wrote. Man is bad, but woman is mean. And we all have known people who went through divorces and how acrimonious it gets. And now I'm beginning to understand the anger and the helplessness of the men that I've known and the kind of revenge taken. I don't know if it would be properly said revenge or the striking out that women do against ex-husbands. And if anybody has read the book, Taking Sex Differences Seriously, it is scientifically established that women are more emotional than men. Women are more prone to being vindictive than men. It's just something that biology dictates. You don't want to be giving women the power and control over a situation like this because it's got to be destructive not only to the men but to the children as well.
I think there's a lot of truth in that. I do. And it also it's a formula. It's a huge earnings. And I think that's the reason it's taken off like wildfire.
So it's basically the lawyers, the class of lawyers that are offenders here. Now, with no relief on the horizon and no group willing to take on this issue, and the lawyers enriching themselves defending womanhood. Is there any hope here?
People need to stop being diffident about speaking out.
Mm-hmm.
Because if people realize what a diabolical evil this is and what destruction this is doing, and this is connected very closely with the bankrupting of our societies and the economic crisis. If you look at every justification, every rationalization for domestic government spending, it's connected with the breakup of the family, whether you're talking about law enforcement or health, all of the major domestic problems, crime, incarceration, all of these things are attributable directly to fatherless homes and the breakup of the family. Well, if you believe that fathers are abandoning their children, then there's not much you can do but throw your hands up and scold the fathers and wag your finger, which is what conservatives are doing. If, on the other hand, you suddenly realize that this is a government policy, divorce laws and connected laws are making this happen, well, then there's a very tangible way to start solving the family crisis, solving the financial crisis. It's big, it's huge, it's enormous, but it gives us a tangible hold on all of these problems and a specific target that we can look at. Specific problems we can target and change.
So you trace the falling birth rates, the juvenile delinquency, rising crime, all kinds of social pathologies. You trace it to this advent of no-fault divorce.
Yes, it's connected with the breakdown of the family, of which no-fault divorce and the machinery and the laws connected with it have basically codified. In other words, the law has not helped the situation. It has made it worse. And that's what needs to be reversed. And we need to have the dialogue, the public discussion around the issues so that we're not just changing the law, but we are changing the culture in the process of changing the law by having discussions and dialogues about it.
Now, how can you get a politician or even a preacher or a leader of an organization to stand up on this issue, because he'll be decried as attacking women? It's an attack on women's rights. It's an attack on motherhood.
Yeah.
I mean, how do you answer that?
You're right. I think you have put your finger on what is the next step. I think at some point we need to bite that bullet. Somebody needs to stand up and say, we in the universities, we in the media, civil society groups, and ordinary citizens need to stand up and start showing the facts of how destructive the feminist lobby is, how destructive the whole sexual agenda is. Same-sex marriage and Obamacare are really only the tip of the iceberg. There's much, much more here that is destructive of our society. I think people will listen to that.
Yeah, it's sort of feminism allied with socialism and the lawyers who are enriching themselves. This deadly combination seems quite unbeatable, actually. I mean, if you just look at it on the face of it.
No, I don't doubt that it's very formidable.
And would you say then that what we want to go back to is where men basically, were able to dominate women, using this in quotes, as before? Is this the goal?
The first goal can simply be to enforce the Constitution. We just enforce the basic Constitution as it is.
To make marriage a contract, an enforceable contract.
That would actually take care of much of this problem. Enforce the contract clause of the Constitution. This would go a long way.
So if marriage loses its romantic interest, the woman can't arbitrarily say, I want romance, I'm divorcing him, and that's it. The man has to actually have done something.
Well, that's right. These basic principles of the law. The idea of taking legally unimpeachable citizens who are sitting in their own home and minding their own business and hauling them into court and issuing them with orders. If they cannot or do not obey the orders, they will be jailed without trial, is obvious tyranny.
And literally there's no organization that exists today that's preparing to fight this fight.
No, there's no specific organization. The fathers groups are fighting for more equity for fathers and fairness in the divorce settlements. But one of the biggest problems is there's no alliance between the groups that claim to be fighting for the family and the fathers groups. What we need desperately is an alliance of all of these groups together, because they are all being picked off one at a time by the feminist lobby, by the sexual lobby. The latest victims are Christian groups and religious freedom. I mean, increasingly we are seeing today sexual freedom and religious freedom are eyeball to eyeball.
Explain that. How does that work? Is it feminism being enforced on the church somehow?
The feminist agenda and the homosexualist agenda are based on sexual freedom. Their bottom line is unrestricted sexual freedom. That's directly contrary to Christian principles, but the sexual lobby doesn't want to hear this. The main threat to its unrestricted sexual freedom is religion, is Christianity especially. This is why the latest issue on the public agenda has become religious freedom, and the main threat to religious freedom. is the sexual lobby.
And of course, the Christian teachings for hundreds and hundreds of years has been that the man is the head of the household, that the wife is to obey her husband. And that actually has been the teaching, hasn't it?
That's correct, yes.
So feminism is basically opposed to Christianity in some fundamental way.
Well, that's right, very much so. And what I lament is the unwillingness, the diffidence, the timidity of Christians to take on not only the homosexual agenda, but the feminist agenda.
I've been talking with Stephen Baskerville. He is the author of Taken into Custody, The War Against Fathers, Marriage, and the Family. I want to thank you for being with us, Stephen. Do you have any last comments for the listeners?
No, thank you very much. We need more shows to devote attention to these issues. So God bless you.
Thanks, Stephen. This has been very good, and the book is fantastic. I mean, I'm a bachelor. I never got married, never had kids, but I know my friends who've gone through divorce and the kind of pain that people don't often share. So everybody's suffering alone, so to speak.
That's right. That's the biggest problem.
Well, thanks so much.
Thank you very much, Jeff. I appreciate it. God bless you.
You've been listening to another podcast for Patriots Who Think with your host, Jeff Nyquist. For more Jeff Nyquist podcasts, log on to jrnyquist.com. That's jrnyquist.com.